to this very special 5 by 15 event with Natalie Haynes and Bettany Hughes. And thank you all so much for being with us. We're thrilled to be welcoming these two brilliant historians and classicists and to have hundreds of people signed up this evening. So thank you for your amazing support. So let me quickly introduce our speakers tonight. Natalie Haynes was once a stand-up comic, and she presents the radio show Stand Up for Classics, the 7th series of which is about to begin. And she's written 3 brilliant novels, including 1,000 Ships, which retells the story of the Trojan War from a female perspective, and which she spoke about at 5 by 15 last year. And we're thrilled that she's back again tonight, talking about Pandora's Jar, which is out now in paperback, and asks how the women of Greek mythology have been portrayed through history, why they've so often been forgotten, and why they've so often been maligned. And joining her tonight is Bettany Hughes, who's also, of course, published many best-selling books, including Istanbul, A Tale of Three Cities. But tonight we want to particularly highlight her most recent book, Venus and Aphrodite, a biography of desire, which is out now in paperback and highly relevant, of course, to this evening's discussion. So you might have seen her latest program, which I think is on BBC 4 at the moment, about Bacchus traveling across Georgia and Jordan and Greece, an incredible program. We're so thrilled to have her with us. You can order the books from our independent bookshop, New and Books, and the details will be in the chat. But for now, I will hand over to Bettany. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, and she will come to as many as she can towards the last 15 minutes of this 1-hour session. But for now, I'll disappear into the virtual wings and welcome Bettany. Thank you very much for being with us.
Oh, Daisy, thank you so much. And thank you for bringing Natalie and I together again. It's so lovely to see you, Natalie. I just have to say that we meet and talk about women in the ancient world quite a bit.
We do.
Sometimes, depending on the mood we're in, sometimes we start and talk about the sustained, shocking, systematic misogyny there is from the beginning of the story of the world onwards in, the written record. And then sometimes we're a bit more positive and we talk about actually women haven't been quite as written out of history as we might seem, and that they are there if we know where to look. So what mood are you in tonight, Natalie? How do you?
I'm feeling quite perky.
Oh, perky.
Perky mood. Yeah, I am. I think I'm in a perky mood. That's what's happened. It's just because I'm always happy to see you. That is the truth. Even in your bizarre old people's home chair. I should say that Bettany is not at home before it sounds like I'm slagging off her decor. This is not her personal chair. It's a guest's chair.
It's true. I should perhaps explain, nor indeed the sort of semi-tartan curtains, whichever way they are, that are decorating my space. So I'm sitting in a small hotel room in Gibraltar, which, and the reason I'm here, interestingly, so let's be positive then. The reason I'm here is because even though, like it or not, women occupy 50% of the human story genetically, as a historian, I noticed that we only occupy about 0.5% of official written record and human history. But my God, we are there. So the reason I'm in Gibraltar is I'm studying the incredible skull of Gibraltar woman, who was actually the first Neanderthal discovered. So we shouldn't be talking about Neanderthals. We should be talking about the Gibraltar females when we talk about that incredible kind of human experience. So Natalie, for you, because you've written this book and it is a brilliant book, and I'm not just saying that because I love you. It's the most fantastic read. It is both kind of funny and shocking and mind-opening and relevant pretty much in every paragraph. But where do you go to when you're trying to find evidence of women whose voices you think have been misrepresented or silenced? What is your primary source? For me, it's often archaeology. Where are you going?
I'm much later than you, because you know that prehistory especially is just not my specialist area, and that's it's all right. They've got you to defend them. So they've got that covered.
All around.
So yeah, I'm almost always going back to text. There is a lot more art and sculpture, ancient and I was going to say modern, but often by modern what I mean is the last 500 years in Pandora's Jar. But there's more art than I've ever written about, for sure. But I still am most likely to be drawn back to, in this instance, Euripides, Hesiod, Homer, Pseudo-Apollodorus, essentially the storytellers and mythographers of the past, because it's a mistake to think that we're the first lot of people to start going, wait a minute, what's happening in this story? The ancients were doing it too. We're asking questions about how myth is told and retold, and which bits of the story are prioritized. I remember almost, kind of stopping in my tracks when I found a moment in Plutarch, I think, where he is talking about the story of Theseus and Phaedra, and he says, Theseus actually has Theseus's marriages had quite bad beginnings and not very happy endings. It's just a tremendously litotic phrase to describe the number of women that Theseus manages to deliberately or accidentally kill over their relationships with him. He's a very dangerous man to marry,
or rape, including Helen as a kind of between 8 and 11-year-old in some versions of the myth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that something is difficult when ancient authors are squeamish about it. So in some versions of the story where Theseus captures Helen, she is 7 years old. 7. Yeah. And in some versions, she's a little bit older, and they sort of round up to 10. And you're like, dude, that literally hasn't improved. Since you thought so. In some versions of that story, she's pregnant by the time her brothers get her back, by the time the Dioscuri reclaim her. And Theseus is assuredly in his 50s by this point, if we follow the timeline of his story. So he is grim in terms of his relationships with women. And she certainly, Pausanias just lists these women that Theseus has either raped or killed, or both. He's killed their parents, or killed their fathers. And then he says, but this story isn't much talked about, because it's not told in any form. So we focus on the bit of the story that gets performed, which is the story of Phaedra that we get in Euripides' Hippolytus, or we might see it in Racine's Phèdre, or whichever version we get. But if Plutarch knew that the story which gets the focus is the story that we then give more prominence to, and that in the case of Phaedra is a woman being bad, then we should definitely know that. Plutarch can work it out. We definitely should know it. So I think I do often go back to these texts in a way, just because you get to then look at what happens to how ancient writers, deconstruct these stories. And sometimes, there are, I know Helen is your special interest because you wrote such a brilliant biography on her. But there's that incredible fragment in Sophocles of the demand for Helen's return, where Helen is shown, and it feels like it must have been written 20 minutes ago. Helen is shown self-harming. She's physically disfiguring her face by drawing writing implements down it. And it's like, the world's most beautiful woman is disfiguring the thing that makes her famous by using the implements that male writers and artists have used to celebrate it. Like, I'm sorry, I don't think I have any space for any more postmodern than this.
No.
Incredible. And that's 5th century BCE, 2,500 years old.
Yeah, completely. And even if you go back to Homer composing whenever, 2,700 years ago or thereabouts, there's that incredible line about Helen where she says, on us has been sent a terrible destiny that we should be a singer's theme for generations to come. So she is absolutely prefiguring the notion of the horror, actually, of a celebrity culture when feme, it's one of our favorite words, that the word feme in ancient Greek becomes pharma in Latin, which gives us our word fame. So this notion that if you are famous or if you seek fame, you are seeking slander, rumor and gossip. And Helen absolutely gets that through, or Homer allows her to have that idea 2,700 years ago. So you are right, there is an extraordinary, there's a kind of modernity and freshness to the thinking in a lot of those texts. And that's something that Pandora's Jar does so brilliantly, because you take what we think we know and you just dive that bit deeper to ask what was hoped to be meant by what was said. And Pandora, we can talk about her for a full hour if you like.
Easily.
She's your specialist subject. But the fact that for people who might not have read their Hesiod that recently, that she's often described, not given a name, but described as the Kalon Kakon, the beautiful evil thing. And I have to say, for years I've got on platforms and said this is appalling. It's Hesiod saying that women are beautiful because they're evil and evil because they're beautiful. But you have a slightly different reading of that phrase.
I do, because I think that's us translating it that way. Those two words are parallel in Greek. They are both visual, physical, beautiful, ugly, kalon, kakon, and also they can be moral, or or in a way like amoral but descriptive of a non-visual quality. So kalos can mean something beautiful, it can mean something finely made, something good, someone morally good, and kakos means the exact opposite, something ugly or badly made, something shoddy or morally deficient, i.e. evil. And what happens when we get that phrase, I think, is that we should translate it like the Greek, to give them both an equal balance. So it should be like beautiful ugly, like the French joli laid. And yet we always see it translated as visually beautiful, but morally bad. And this is my t-shirt for this book. I'm afraid that's not in the Greek. So it's like, well, sure, Hesiod is, he is not the biggest fan of women in general. Things that Hesiod doesn't like, women, he finds them inferior morally to bees, and brothers, he finds them inferior morally to himself. And so the story of Pandora in particular is an absolute payday for him, because he gets to say this beautiful woman who is evil is then sent to be the wife to a stupid brother who I don't like, who the stupid brother of Prometheus, brother of Prometheus. So this is a massive double bonus for him. But I think it's really important that we at least take a moment. Hesiod surely does not mean, given that the gods have created, Hephaestus has created, and Athene has helped to give skills to, and the hours and the seasons have helped to decorate her clothes and everything. We're surely meant to think that Pandora is beauty, that she is this beautiful figure. We're told that she is an evil in whom mortal men will delight. So we are definitely meant to think of her as being beautiful. But are we meant to think of her as being morally reprehensible? Is she a femme fatale? Well, yeah, maybe, but maybe also no. Maybe also she is this thing which is both beautiful and ugly. She's an agent of change, and that's the important thing. Zeus wants to shake things up. Something has happened which shakes up the world, which he doesn't want to have happened. Namely, Prometheus steals fire, which has been in the realm of the gods, and gives it to mortals. So that already makes things very different. And then Pandora is the payback for that. She is ant agathou. She's the price for, this is in exchange for this good thing that we've got, fire. So yeah, we might want to say, well, in that case, she's definitely evil because she's the price for a good thing. But when we pay for something, for example, do we consider money to be evil because it's the literal price for a good thing? Or do we consider it to be amoral, something completely, we put all our own ethical issues onto that. And I think Pandora is much more like that. Hesiod says the carefree age of men comes to an end because of this moment. Well, the carefree age of men, Hesiod, was just men and no fire. So it was basically like, what were you eating? Who were you talking to? You were just sitting there in your man way, gnawing on the leg of a deer or something, which was cold because you didn't have any fire. And you didn't even have a nice woman to talk to cheer you up about the fact that you were gnawing on the leg of a deer. That, of course, your life was carefree then. What did you have to care about? You were bored out of your minds, gnawing. And so, yes, I feel very strongly about this. I think Pandora has been misserved.
And do you think, because it's so interesting hearing you talk, because as we know, with the ancient authors, there are, even with Plato, definitely with the tragedians, not so much with Aristotle, I have to say, but there are moments, Herodotus definitely too, when those authors are exploring the issue that they have in the contemporary world that they see around them, which is a world of absolute inequity. Clearly, these are slave cultures that they're operating in. So, the slaves who are described as man-footed things at this point as less than human. So that is the sea that they're swimming in. Women, even if they're citizens, are beyond second-class citizens. So do you think that they are asking themselves moral questions as they write, or do you think that there's a kind of a guilt or a kind of genetic memory or a collective memory of a time before? And I'm talking about the Bronze Age, not, I should say, that I think the Bronze Age was in any way a kind of feminist wonderland. There were definitely not mother goddesses. There was definitely not a matriarchy. But you do see in some of those primary sources sections of culture where women seem to have more equity than they do by the time we get to the classical world. So, women in the Bronze Age, so we're talking 3,500 years ago, they have these things called onar to, which are portions of land. And if they have portions of land, that means they're landowners and they're taxed. So that must mean that they have disposable income. Sometimes we hear of them speaking in council. Do you think that actually those male writers of this, particularly this kind of 7th, 6th, and 5th and 4th centuries BCE, are they dealing with a kind of mistily remembered moment of history where things were a bit different, or do you think they're just kind of freshly looking at the world around them and kind of asking as almost like a kind of intellectual parlor game what role women might otherwise have had in society?
It's difficult, isn't it? I think Aristophanes is definitely doing that. We have 3 plays basically where Aristophanes says, what happens if women have political power?
Mm-hmm.
It's chaos and shenanigans and jinx ensue. And I think he's quite politically, he's quite small c conservative. So I think he's just enjoying, mixing things up. He's a comedian. You cannot rely on comedians to take things seriously. Believe me when I say I know of which I speak. But I think particularly with Euripides, there's a sense that he writes the most incredible roles for women in theatre at all, by the way, until, I don't know, Chekhov, Ibsen, something like that. There is no role in Shakespeare that you would want to play, I think, as a woman. The female role, I mean, I guess, Glenda Jackson playing King Lear notwithstanding, there is no role in Shakespeare you would want to play as much as you'd want to play Medea. If you're an older woman, there is no role you'd want to play as much as Hecate. There just isn't. They're incredible parts. And when we look at how he's presenting these women, it's like there's a little time loop between the Bronze Age where the plays are set, which is hundreds of years before he's writing in the 5th century BCE, and the world that he's reflecting, the actual world in which he lives, back at the audience who may well have been at the Dionysia, the drama festival held every year in Athens where his plays were first performed, which may well have been a purely male audience. We don't know for sure, but it seems pretty likely that given that women are so often excluded from the civic space in 5th century Athens, and given that theatre is a civic engagement in 5th century Athens, it seems pretty likely they're just men. The roles of women are being played by men. The play obviously has been written by a man. And so when, for example, we get that big opening monologue that Medea gives in Euripides' version of her story, she says, it's terrible being a woman, and here's why. Because there's a mark, she says, to tell real gold from the fake stuff, but there isn't that on a man. So you don't know whether you've got a good one or a bad one. If you have got a bad one, there's just nothing worse than that, because he can go out and do whatever he likes, but we have to stay at home. And he can fool around and we can't do that. We buy a husband, she's talking about the idea of a dowry, of course. We buy a husband and we don't know what we're getting. And if things don't work out, he can fool around. We're just stuck with this, and that's the life that we've got. And she says to the women of the chorus, because she's a foreigner in their land, she says it's better for you than for me, because at least you've got your fathers and brothers and family around to protect you, but I don't have that. So there's nothing worse than being a woman. And we hear that monologue and we go, that's fantastic. Hang on a minute. Who are you talking about? Who would you buy with a dowry in this version of the story, or any version of the story, Medea? You eloped with Jason. So this locked up version of you, this cloistered version of you, that's the 5th century women we're talking about. 5th century upper class women are cloistered. Obviously, if you're lower class and you don't have money, then you go out to work. We can see, that there are plenty of examples of it. But upper class women have this much more cloistered existence. And it's like, well, whose life are you reflecting here? Medea doesn't have a dowry. She doesn't wait at home for a appropriate suitor to be decided by her father. She let's remind ourselves, she essentially helps her adventurer lover to steal the golden fleece from her father. She kills, and it is true that she doesn't have a brother to defend her interests, but in fairness, that is because she killed and dismembered him before the play began. So cry me a river, Medea. The reason you don't have a brother is for the excellent reason. And so but it's this extraordinary moment. The life that she's talking about is the life that's led by the wives of the men who are watching the play. It's not the life that she has led herself. And you have to think Euripides is an unusually sensitive observer of the human condition. And that's not just true of, for example, this sort of social situation that women live in. But it's true of really what we might think of as really basic, very intimate, not known about by men, biological things. So at the start of the Phoenicide, the Phoenician women, Jocasta, who in this version of the story has survived the revelation that she had married her son, spoiler, she says that her son Oedipus had been taken from her when he was only 3 days old. He's exposed on a mountainside. She believes him to have died. But instead, of course, as we know, he is adopted by somebody else. And she talks about the woman who adopts Oedipus. She says, she nursed the child my labor pains produced. Now, how many men can we assume were sort of sitting there holding their wife's hand going, breathe, breathe? Surely not. You know, this was surely being done by midwives. And equally, how many men would be thinking about women producing breast milk? You know, there were wet nurses, for heaven's sake. This just isn't. And there's Euripides going, you know, the loss of a baby at 3 days old would be an intense physical experience for both for the woman who loses him and the woman who acquires him. And that is an astonishing, and I would go so far as to say a revolutionary attitude for a man of not only his time, but frankly of virtually any time up to, you know, our lifetime. It's an astonishing thing for a male writer to be thinking about.
It is. I mean, but there are, it's so interesting because there are snatches of that kind of sympathy or empathy that you also find in other authors like Homer, because I know that, you know, we've both got a very cherished passage where one of the goddesses brushes an arrow off one of her favorite soldiers, and the beautiful description is as a mother brushes a fly off the face of a sleeping baby. And just in those two lines, time has collapsed, and you understand what, you know, what that mother felt, and also the author composing how they were imagining that woman. See, it's so interesting hearing you talk about this, because as you know, because I sort of live in the Bronze Age, that's my happy place. So I'm sort of there in my head the whole time. And you know, if you look at the princesses of Colchis, where Medea comes from, at that time, these are wealthy, independent women. And interesting that Daisy mentioned Georgia in the introduction. You know, when you go to Colchis, when you go to Georgia and you look at the palaces they lived in, and you can read some of the text describing their lives, and then look at how Medea is still cherished in that society today. So if you go to this kind of incredible sort of rock and roll port of Batumi on the Black Sea, there's an enormous statue of Medea as this dignified, as I say, kind of resourceful role model for the young girls of Georgia to look up to today. You know, there's no question that Medea is a child killer, you know, that she shouldn't have poisoned Jason. So I think there's a really interesting, I think it's fascinating when you get this kind of trickle down of historical reality. And as you know, again, there's this extraordinary author called Enheduanna, who is one of the first named authors in the world, the first named female author in the story of the world. And she's a princess and a female poet. She writes incredible works praising the goddess Inanna, you know, the great war and sex goddess, who was the kind of many times great grandmother of Aphrodite, Venus. And if you read the poems written by Enheduanna describing her, A, they're beautiful, B, they're unbelievably feisty. So she talks about Inanna as riding on fire, red power, flood storm, hurricane adorned, battle planner, foe smasher. She's writing about this goddess who allows men to be women and women to be men. There's an understanding that we have both male and female within us. And again, if you look at her life, you know, that is a woman who has status and standing in court. So I do think, you're absolutely right. You know, it's both kind of extraordinary sensitivity, but I do think that some of these stronger female characters, I do think that they are kernels of historical truth that almost by accident, if not by design, have trickled down through some of those texts and then reappear kind of, for instance, in the Greek plays. But Enheduanna, you know, who should be a household name, who is both kind of brilliant, you know, and the most kind of fascinating historical character. When she is discovered and her poems are discovered in the 1920s, they occupy not even a page, half a page in the archaeologists' written notes, and people forget. That's all a bit awkward and embarrassing. So you know, we do have this problem of women being there very kind of definitely, you know, with positive roles, but they are then written out of history often by modern 20th century, 19th to 20th century archaeologists and historiographers.
And often we forget that the values that we're bringing that feel to us universal simply are not, you know. So we find Medea really troubling because she kills her children, but of course in the Euripides play, the gods endorse that decision. We might not like it, and you almost never see it staged that way. She's almost always shown as mad at the end, because it's the only way really you can, it seems, present the play to a modern audience. But that judgment on her, that moral judgment on her, is not particularly, it's like, how will you do this to yourself, Medea? You know, how will you kill them? How will you ruin your own old age? Is much more of a theme of the play than, oh, but children, they deserve to live their people too, which doesn't really come up. And again, you know, we might think that the idea of, for example, of Helen being the villain of the Trojan War is completely uncontested. But of course it isn't, because in that fantastic agone in the Troades, the Euripides play Trojan Women, she says to Hecate, to the mother of Paris, who largely gets away without anywhere near as much responsibility, although Homer is a bit more on the ball. She says, you know, it's your fault. You had this, there was this prophecy that Paris would destroy the city of Troy, your city. And, you know, you didn't expose him as a baby like you should have done. And it's quite hard for a contemporary audience to go, I'm sorry, did you just berate a woman for not killing her baby child? But that's not being questioned in the Greek. You know, in the Greek, it's just like, yeah, why didn't you do that? And it's a genuine question that's allowed to stand.
Yeah, and you've got to look at what happens to Helen, you know, at the end of the Trojan War. So, you know, we're told very clearly she's dragged the known world in her wake. She's condemned hundreds, if not thousands, to pitiless, gruesome, grueling deaths. Hesiod again talks about, you know, the great heroes traveling across the Mediterranean for rich tressed Helen's sake, and yet, when we last see her in the Odyssey, she's returned back to Sparta. So, you know, the Trojan War lasted for 10 years. It took some of the heroes 10 years to get back. But there she is back in Sparta again. She's in charge. She's a queen. There really doesn't seem to be many recriminations. And the kind of last time we hear of her, she's leading her husband Menelaus to their marital bed to sleep between purple sheets, which is both regal and a bit sexy. So there's kind of quite a lot going on there, you know, in the mention of purple.
So long as you don't think of the sea snails that gave the purple, which reduces the sexiness all told for me. It's like, oh.
God, so I know. So I'm sure everybody who's listening to know. So the colour purple was very, very expensive in the ancient world, and there were kind of lots of, you know, mock versions. But Wanax purpura, as it is in the Linear B tablets, so the purple of kings comes from this sea snail called a murex, and you need about 12,000 individual sea snails in order to get enough purple to dye the hem of a single garment. So, you know, that was having purple sheets, that really showed that you derived. But isn't it interesting, as I say, that Helen, in a way, she has the upper hand at the end of that. She
definitely has the upper hand, because she is drugging him with you know, whatever that dubious drug is that she's got from her friend Polydamna in Egypt. The Nepenthes drug is so dodgy.
It is. Well, can I just tell you, I know all about that drug for two reasons. One,
Bettany. May I remind you that what you're about to say is on the record?
I know, it's all being recorded. I can tell you, you know, only because I'm a historical researcher, two things. Really fascinating. So exactly as you say, there's this amazing lively scene when we hear that Helen's back at home and she's mixing up this kind of druggy brew so that the Trojan War veterans can forget all of their sorrow. And a lot of academic ink has been spilt on this, saying, you know, is it showing that she's a sorceress? But actually, when you analyse the terracotta pots that are left often in the graves of women from the Bronze Age, we know that they contain industrial quantities of laudanum, so opiates in liquid form, so opiates mixed with alcohol. So it looks like actually this was exactly one of the roles of women in that Bronze Age culture. So I'm sure Helen, the Helen equivalents, actually did that. And this is where it does get slightly dodgy. So I had the great pleasure of quite well sniffing, which sounds kind of very tame, but then also imbibing freshly picked blue lotus from the Nile. And we think actually probably Helen is talking about both opiates and blue lotus. And the blue lotus, which was everywhere in the ancient Egyptian world, you know, in palaces, in temples, in feasts and festivals, was famous both as a kind of feel-good drug and as an aphrodisiac. Natalie Haynes, there was definitely something going on after sniffing the blue lotus.
Interesting.
Really interesting. So, you know, those authors knew what they were doing. So
Yeah.
exactly as you say, Helen is, you know, she's really strong at the end of that story. But also there's a version where she doesn't go to Troy at all. That it's
which
an
is
idol.
as old as the Troy version.
Which is incredible.
At least the 8th century.
Yeah, so she's hanging out. She gets kind of, you know, her ship takes her to the shores of Egypt, and it's a ghost, an eidolon, that goes to Troy. So these stupid men are fighting over a ghost, but she is blameless. And that, as you say, that's not as popular a version of the story now, but my goodness, it was throughout antiquity.
Yeah, again, you can rely on Euripides for this one, because in his play Helen, that's the version that we see. And of course, when the Greek heroes coming home from Troy, they spend the entire war plays out in the same way. So they spend 10 years fighting over the Eidolon, the image which is made out of air by the gods to cause the war. And then when they finally get their hands on her, as the war ends, she disappears into the air that she's made of. So it is one of the great metaphors for the futility of war. But when the Greek heroes arrive at Egypt, including Menelaus, who's going to be reunited with his wife, with Helen, we discover that Helen is exactly as wronged, as blamed as she might ever have been, because they believed that they fought the war of her. So she has been, even though she's had this completely blameless asexual decade in the palace of Proteus, who is famously chaste, brackets TE, not ED, then, you know, she still gets blamed for being the slut of the story every time.
I do wonder if we're being a little bit generous, over generous to the authors of antiquity, though, because I mean, there are some pretty shocking texts in there. We talked about Hesiod. There's also this poet from the island of Amorgos called Simonides, and he was really popular. Street poet. Anybody who's watching this, please now go and Google Simonides' poem about women, just because it will get you really fired up for the evening, because you'll be so furious, where he compares women, what is it, to dogs and foxes and
any animal he can find. Yeah, they're cunning, they're ugly, they're this, they're that. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the archetypal misogynist screeds, I suppose. There's never been any shortage of misogyny. I guess what bothers me about, you know, for example, the mistranslation of words that are neutral in Greek, or morally neutral in Greek. We talked about kalon and kakon, but also, for example, the word for slave, which is used in the Odyssey to describe the slave women who Odysseus and Telemachus slaughter when Odysseus returns to Ithaca, because they see them as having conspired with the suitors who've been trying to undermine his kingdom and threatening the safety of his son. But obviously these women have no agency because they are slaves. So they can't just say to these men, oh, you know, get off, and expect to be understood and heard. That they're slaves. And in the Greek, the word is slave, and the female word for the female and plural word for the is placed before it. And that's how we should read it. And indeed, if you read Emily Wilson's excellent translation, that is how you'll read it. But if you read virtually any translation before that, you'll get it described, they'll be described as sluts, slatterns, harlots, whores, any quantity of overwritten modern misogyny. I say modern, I mean often 19th and 20th century, in order to justify this behavior of a Greek hero who obviously these men have a big boy crush on. And it's like, I get your big boy crush, but stop monstering the women, god damn it. This just is annoying, quite aside from anything else. It's bad translation, and you know what makes me angry. I'm like Harrison Ford in the future. It falsifies research. So yeah, no, it is really irritating. It's like there's plenty of misogyny to go around in the ancient world. We don't need to add in our own later versions of misogyny. And so you do still get people responding really negatively occasionally, and not in large quantities, when you try and take that modern prejudice away. And so you get the occasional reviewer going, well, how dare this person retell the Odyssey? How dare they rewrite Homer? It's like, dude, I don't know which version you've been reading, but not the Greek.
Yeah, completely. Do you think, I mean, oh my gosh, I'd love this so much if this was true, but I fear it's not going to be. The one, I'm so upset by Aristotle, because Aristotle really is smart, but what Aristotle has to say about women is so unbelievably damaging, because, as you know, quite a lot of his works were sort of taken as canon and as medical texts that were referred to right up into the 19th century. And he talks about women as kind of oozing, leaky creatures, and this notion that, you know, a woman's evil can actually physically turn a glass dark if she looks at you. She tries to kind of pierce you with her lust. I have to say, I haven't tackled Aristotle to retranslate, but do you think he's as horrific as he seems to be? Or
you say that, but I actually can turn a glass dark with my lust, so you know, I'm fine with that. That seems to me just factual. Yeah, Edith Hall is brilliant on Aristotle. She wrote a very good book called Aristotle's Way. Professor Edith Hall, obviously, of King's College London, and her argument is that Aristotle was so clever and so interested in inquiry that even though he is wholly mistaken on the subject of women, and he is about other things, I mean, he's really bad on human biology. You don't ever want to go, you want to go to Aristotle for analysis of plays or politics. You do not want to go to him for medical advice, because although he is absolutely fascinated by animals and plants and science in general, I mean, he's basically the inventor of the biological sciences, he still thinks there are, for example, humours and stuff like that. Do not go to Aristotle for medical advice, is my suggestion to you. But Edith's argument is that, you know, he would have refined his position if he'd had the opportunity to, that had he been faced with intelligent, educated women who would debate with him, he would have realized the error of his ways. You know, you have to hope that that's true, because he is a really brilliant thinker. But yes, he's an advocate of slavery, and he's an advocate of the inferiority of women. And those two things have been incredibly damaging in modern cultures, which have taken Aristotle as their sort of starting philosophical point. And that's the thing that we have to bear in mind, is that although there are those incredible moments where time just seems to collapse, we're a really long way away from how people thought and what they knew. And so Aristotle is by no means anything other than, you know, one of the most intelligent people who ever lived. But that doesn't mean he's right about everything, because there's a limit to how much material he has, you know. And this is true generally, I think, of belief systems that belong to such a distant time in the past. You know, I always say to people, I think it's not a stupid idea to think that the god Poseidon can create earthquakes, because how would you ever know about tectonic plates? How could you possibly know that beneath the land and the sea are separate things which move against you? You couldn't possibly make that guess. So, you know, the god of the sea is angry and smashes his trident against the floor of the sea is not a stupid idea. It may not be entirely rational, but it's also not dumb.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And what they can totally understand is that we are within nature. We're not external to it. I mean, just the number of times I've heard COVID briefings, you know, with Boris, for example, talking about, you know, this is what we have to do in the face of nature, as if somehow we as humans are not part of it. Yeah. But, you know, the Greeks, wow, they got that to the power of X, you know, the way that they understand the world. And I think, you know, you're right. It wouldn't be, I'll tell you what I was just thinking about Aristotle. What an amazing riff it would be to put Aristotle together with Hypatia, who's also a philosopher and mathematician and scientist.
Astronomer, yeah, amazing.
Amazing, from Alexandria. You know, they're separated by about 700, 800 years. But Hypatia, who was super smart as a woman, and then because she is a woman and she gets caught up in the kind of politics of that period in Alexandria, suffers the most horrific death. And she's basically attacked by a religious mob, and she's flayed alive with a straka, either with pottery sherds or with oyster shells, and dismembered. I mean, you know, she is a real woman, and her end is appalling. But actually, she would have been a match for Aristotle if only they lived at the same points in antiquity. That would have been quite a meeting of minds, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing that you kind of have to bear in mind, is that it's really easy to see ancient Greece or ancient Rome as in themselves a single time. But actually, of course, the ancient Greek civilization is 2,000 years old. You know, the distance between Hypatia and Aristotle is like the distance between us and Chaucer? I mean, it's a really, really long way. So it is important to bear in mind that there are some changes in those societies across hundreds of years.
Yeah, exactly. And that, yeah, but what I find both sort of, you know, enlightening and depressing is that the treatment of women, it absolutely, you know, it's neither cyclical nor linear, but it goes in these kind of waves. So you have, you know, incredible characters like Pudjahepa, who's the queen of the Hittites, again back in the Bronze Age, you know, really sure of herself. She writes the most fantastically kind of tick off letters to Ramesses the Great, Ramesses II, who is the most powerful man in the world at the time, and she thinks that he hasn't given enough dowry for one of her daughters who's going off to be married. And she sort of sends in this letter saying, you know, if you say you have nothing, the sun god has nothing, and basically, you know, pull yourself together and send me back some more gold, which actually doesn't arrive. But you have her in the Bronze Age, you know, around 1200 BCE, and then again, as you're saying, kind of separated by eons of time, Theodora in Constantinople. So we're talking about the 6th century AD, who is very similar in the way that she deals with kind of recalcitrant leaders elsewhere in Egypt, and sort of talks about how weak they're being. And, you know, as you know, I'm a great fan of both Helen and of Theodora, who is a real woman who tries to put in all kinds of social reforms as soon as she has power as a Byzantine empress. And she sets up a safe house for prostitutes and for single women, penalties for rape and infanticide and pimping are increased on her watch. So it is really interesting how you, as I said, you get these kinds of nuclear waves, a time when we see women to have real impact and effect in the world, but it is not consistent. You know, there does seem to have to be a kind of particular set of circumstances that allows that to happen. But I wonder if we should sort of involve all the amazing people who are with us, who are sending extremely interesting questions.
Are they? I can't see them. Tell me what they say.
Yeah, I can choose.
The power.
So a nice simple one to start with. So this is from Antonin. He says he's particularly interested in modern retellings of ancient myths. So, cleverly, he says, like Mike Bartlett's TV series Dr. Foster after Medea, Camilla Shamsi's Home Fire, Antigone, and Madeline Miller's Circe. Why has it taken so long for these ancient texts to become mainstream again? Why is classics having a moment?
I think the short answer is because publishers have realized that people will buy them and read them. For the longest time, there was a sort of belief in publishing, A, that men didn't read books written by women, B, that men didn't read fiction, C, that classics was a sort of preserve of the elite men, and therefore, you know, this leads you to the inexorable conclusion that no one is going to read classic stories retold by women unless they're focused on elite men, which, for example, Mary Renault's books largely are. You know, they tell the story of Theseus, or indeed Simonides, or you know, and so those entirely subvert this notion, because, you know, men read Mary Renault in their hundreds of thousands, I should think. You know, she's always the writer that people talk about as having introduced them to the stories of Greek myth, or, you know, time without number. You get people talking to you about her. But the idea, I think, that we might focus the story on women, that's just because suddenly, you know, we're allowed. We were all waiting. We've all been reading this stuff, you know, and then, you know, people kind of go, oh, okay, well, once Madeline had written the Song of Achilles, which obviously made a few furious people go, wait a minute, gay sex in ancient Greece. I don't know what to say to you, mate. Don't look at any vase paintings. You're going to be absolutely appalled. It's like, but boy, should you never read Plato. That's my suggestion to you. But once they'd got past the absolute sheer and wanton horror of the notion that men might find other men sexually attractive, then I think that you know, it sold zillions of copies in the US and the UK and all over the world. And then obviously, yeah, there's been it opened doors that meant that, you know, women were suddenly allowed to retell these stories. The first novel I wrote was a modern retelling of a Greek myth, so it was set in the modern world, the Amber Fury. And I'm not sure it would have been possible for me to write 1,000 Ships at that point. You know, Chanel was published in 2014, and Ships was published in 2019, and the climate had simply changed in that. So, you know, I think that readers came out of the shadows and bought the books, and that's what made the difference. Publishers are not psychic, but equally they're not stupid. If people are buying books, they publish the book.
Absolutely. I mean, you're so right, because when I was writing that non-fiction book about Helen, which I think came out in 2003, I was told by a number of my academic colleagues that it was a very fluffy subject, and you know, that I would be really damaging my academic reputation by dealing with such a fluffy subject as Helen, which put a certain degree of fire in my belly, I have to say, to insist to do. But you know, you are right. You know, that again, that sort of sea that we're swimming in has definitely changed. I've just got to stand up for Mary Renault. You know, you have to pronounce her Renault, not Renault.
Oh, I didn't know that. No, I didn't.
Bonus fact. Bonus fact, why she insisted on that is because when she was, you know, she, as you know, she was a nurse during World War II, and it was when Hitler was using Renault cars, and she didn't want to be associated with the cars that Hitler was using, so she styled herself Renault. So there we are. I know, fun fact. And I do like the fact that she talks about having partyish times, but yes, you know, thank goodness it's changed, and that your books are doing so fabulously well, along with kind of Madeline's and Camilla's. So somebody is asking, is the association, which is Pandora, because I know that you're talking about Pandora, is the association of Pandora with the acquisition of fire a pre-shadowing of women being seen in the realm of the kitchen? Question mark? Exclamation mark.
I think probably fire is outdoors for a longish time before it's indoors, so I'm going to have to say no.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think so. The Cyclops, Polyphemus, has fire in the Odyssey, for example. So I think the notion that fire is domestic is okay, but the notion that women would be associated with the fire, it's much harder to delineate women's roles anyway in a society which has domestic servitude. So if there is any task that women are associated with, it's not cooking, it's always weaving. 100% of the time it's weaving. And that's in Bronze Age stories, that's what we find women doing, and that will run right the way through until, you know, the Roman Empire, when Augustus is talking about his wife Livia and how respectable she is, because she stays at home and weaves all day.
Exactly. Loom weights. So I think we find so many bloody loom weights in archaeological digs. You just think they are tokens of oppression. I don't want to find another loom weight. Actually, I tell you what, weaving, and also interestingly water carrying, and that's something that women consistently do, and we see that in the evidence of the skeletal evidence of human remains, that women often have these really compacted necks because they're carrying water on their heads. And again, what's interesting is the literary sources talk about this, but they always talk about the fact that when women went to the well or to the spring, that was their chance to talk and to exchange not just gossip, but ideas. And I think that was definitely a kind of a historical reality. So somebody's also saying, I think this was Laura Pope, said, although they're very slim pickings, interesting question this, who do you think is the most revered woman in antiquity? Interesting.
Real or mythological?
I think it's open.
In terms of real, I suppose it's probably, for the Greeks, is it Aspasia? I mean, how mad is that? But Aspasia, who is, you know, Pericles, who is the great statesman of 5th century Athens, delivers this incredible funeral speech, which many of us were thinking about last year in bleak times. At the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War, which begins in 431 BCE, at the end of that first year, they have plague, because what's happened is that the people who live in sort of around Athens, in the area of Attica, have been drawn inside the city walls because the area has been invaded by other Greeks, by Spartans and their allies. And so there are people who are overcrowded, and, you know, as we might expect, then plague arises, and the death toll is enormous. Pericles himself will go on to die of plague, but he delivers this funeral speech, which is told to us by, or invented by, because ancient history is not quite like modern history, by Thucydides, the 5th century historian. And in that, he says, right towards the end, he's delivered this incredible, you know, oration. And right towards the end, he says, on the subject of women, you know, it's the best thing for women is that they shouldn't be spoken about either in praise or blame. And it's like, so that's slightly worse than Victorian women, who could be, you know, seen but not heard like children. But they can't be spoken about at all. They should basically not exist. And so it's a source of enormous delight to me that Pericles shacks up with Aspasia, the most notorious woman of 5th century Athens, about whom everybody talks. So Aristophanes writes jokes about her. Yeah, she's the only real woman, I think I'm right to say, like historical woman mentioned in Plato, the whole of Plato, the entire surviving work of Plato. And so she's incredibly
he says that, sorry, he says that she's Socrates' tutor, doesn't she? It doesn't Plato, so, you know.
So she taught him rhetoric. That's how Socrates gets so good at talking, is because he's got a tutor. So, you know, and she's in the work of, I think, Xenophon as well. So, you know, this incredible, obviously very bright woman who could hold her own amongst these, you know, super brains of any time, let alone, you know, this particular time. You know, their relationship is obviously remarkable. And Pericles dies, having left his Athenian citizen wife in order to shack up with Aspasia in what we would call perhaps a common law marriage, but what we mean is they lived together in sin, just before sin had been invented. And his children by Aspasia are made citizens. There's almost no examples of this happening. It's so rare. The Athenians guard their citizenship really tightly, but for the sake of the memory of Pericles, and perhaps, you know, also because of the esteem in which Aspasia is held. Who knows? Yeah, the jokes that Aristophanes makes about her are always really, you know, saucy. But I've made this comparison many times on stage, and I make no apology for it. Trying to work out who a real person is when all you have is jokes in Aristophanes is like trying to identify who Barbara Streisand is if the only piece of material you had 2,000 years after she'd been alive is the South Park episode Mecha Streisand, where giant robot Barbara Streisand tries to destroy South Park, and we would be sitting there in 2,500 years going, so was she like robotic? Was she famously destructive? We'd be trying to work out who Barbara Streisand was, and we wouldn't get anywhere near it. It's like we wouldn't have a joke, because that's how jokes work. So what I love, I suppose, about Aspasia is that she's so opaque to us, but she obviously was this incredibly, you know, influential character. But, you know, who knows who is the most esteemed and respected woman in the ancient world? There are, contrary to popular belief, so very many to choose from.
Yes, I mean, again, this is slightly controversial, but I do think, you know, it was a grim time for women in the classical period. So again, we're talking around kind of 2,500, 2,400 years ago. I do think we need to look a bit more at the role of women in religion and ritual. And you've got to think, you know, ancient Greek religion, there is no separate word for religion. Gods and goddesses and demigods and spirits are everywhere and in everything. And women were often thought to be the kind of occupants of society who had to keep those gods on side, and were deeply involved in ritual. So that's not just kind of going and putting church flowers on the altar on a Saturday night or Saturday afternoon. And a lot of that activity happens at night. And I just think there's a whole kind of history of the nighttime life, ritual life of places like Athens, where women, I think, were much more present than absent. You know, we know that they were often the keepers of the keys of temples, and temples were basically banks in the ancient world. And that is, you know, so to be the bank manager of the Parthenon, for instance, you know, that's quite a good job to have. So I think, as you said before, I think we need to look very carefully at the sources, because they've been selected and then written about in a very particular way. So we've got some fantastic questions. So two things. Somebody says Sappho, just Sappho.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable. The 10th muse. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. She is wonderful. You know, I love her. I wish we had more of her. It kills me. 9 books of lyric poetry she wrote, and we've got sort of 3 poems and some fragments. It's insufficient.
It is. And she, I mean, again, you've heard me say this before, Natalie, but my God, Sappho, I would teach Sappho in every school. The fact, because she writes about first love, or just love, so extraordinary. She talks about the fire creeping under your skin, and the fact
love as a physical condition.
Yes, totally, and that it's bittersweet. It's so helpful to read her poems, because you realise you're not being an idiot, that actually, you know, this is something that young women and girls have been going through for at least 26 centuries and probably longer. So I'm just looking at this is from Pan Bennett. I so enjoyed The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. Despite all the gore, it stayed resonating with me. Do you think this is a positive addition to the tales of the Trojan War? Silence of the Girls.
Yeah, why not? It's a couple of years since I read it, so I don't feel, it's not at the forefront of my mind currently, because obviously I've had to process quite a lot of books since then. But yeah, I reviewed it for somebody at the time it came out, but I've forgotten who. The Spectator, the New Statesman, I don't remember.
So somebody is also saying they're being very sweet, and they're saying they love your shows, and they love them, and they love our books. And which translation of the Odyssey and the Iliad would you recommend? And I think the Odyssey probably Emily Wilson.
Emily Wilson all day long for the Odyssey. I flip between Caroline Alexander and Robert Fagles for the Iliad.
Yes.
Emily is doing the Iliad next, I think. That's what she's working on. But we're going to have to wait for her to finish hers. So yes, I flit around. I'm extremely unhelpful. People always come to me for translations, and the answer is I don't use them in anything like a useful way. And often the only version I have is the one from when I was an undergraduate. So, you know, it's 20 years out of date. So yes, I'm a terrible person to ask. Ask a librarian or a bookseller. They are on top of things.
Okay, so Maura Welsh says, hi, is misogyny just a fact of life, whether it's ancient or modern women? Do females just have to live with it? Question mark.
No, we do not.
No, we do not.
No, we do not. We need to shove them down wells like the Spartans. We shouldn't shove misogynists down wells. It's illegal.
No, we should. We should shove misogyny. So it's like you don't, you know.
Yeah, all right. We'll shove an abstract noun down a well. I'm happy with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And which woman from ancient times would you want to have dinner with? This is from Fabienne.
Oh God, all of them. Can I not have dinner with all the women of ancient times? How am I supposed to? Am I fictional, real? I don't know. Yes, Hypatia, because I think we'd be able to talk about maths, and I really like maths.
Yes.
And you know, and yes, Aspasia, obviously, because then we could talk about art and rhetoric, and that would be really interesting. And you know, yes, Livia, because I want to know if she actually poisoned anybody or if she was just cruelly misrepresented. Agrippina the Younger, the greatest Roman emperor the Romans never had, who would have been far better at ruling the empire than her idiot son Nero. And you know, the list is as long as your proverbial arm. I want to talk to, you know, Claudia Severa, whose handwriting was found at Hadrian's Wall, inviting her sister for dinner. The oldest example of a woman's handwriting found in the UK. You know, who doesn't want to talk to all these women? Idiots is who.
Hypatia, you know, famously, she was supposed to, she has this rather kind of drippy scholar who was mad about her, and she's supposed to have waved her menstrual rag at him and said, look, this is what, you know, if you get into bed with me, literally, this is what you're getting into bed with. You're getting into bed with.
Yeah, I don't want her to do that at dinner. I'm not going to lie. It's not just the vegetarian in me, but generally, I would rather that didn't happen. I think does that happen in the first series, the first episode, maybe, of Orange is the New Black? Have I imagined that? Does Kate Mulgrew give Piper a tampon in a sandwich? I feel like that happens. I'm sorry, everybody. Some of you are probably eating. I feel terrible for the fact that this has just happened. This is worse than when I said we should push people down a well. Why do you? And we've got like 2 minutes. We've got 50 questions to get through, so I think we might have to have a full quick fire.
But do you? I mean, just why are we all collectively through technology sitting and talking about this at all? Why does it matter? You know, why apart from interest, why does it matter that we engage with these characters, either real or imagined, from a very, very distant past?
Because it's all our past. I feel very strongly about this, as you know. The ancient world belongs to all of us. It doesn't just belong to the 7% of people who go to fee-paying schools. It's all our history. This is all our cultural history. And if the only version of stories you ever see are versions where men have adventures and women sit at home, or occasionally go, oh, but be careful, which is basically all action films that I love from the 90s, that's kind of what I grew up on. It took me longer than I would have liked it to go, well, I could just put women at the center of these stories. You know, well, why wouldn't I? And it's not good enough. It's just not good enough. And, you know, men deserve the chance to empathize with female characters. Boys reading when they're young deserve the chance to empathize with characters, not just to see, you know, a leading character who looks and sounds like them. And women deserve the chance to see themselves as the you know, agents of their own fortune, not the, you know, not being in a coma and waiting for a prince to come and wake you up. That's not good enough. It's not good enough. And there are these incredible stories about women that have existed for millennia, and I don't understand why we haven't been telling them as much as we should have been, but we're going to tell them now, because now I'm here.
Hurrah! Are you by any chance a broadcaster, Natalie? Because you just final question on the note
down that clock
of 2030, and we've now got a huge number, 60 questions waiting to be asked. So Daisy, I think, is going to come back on because we've reached the end of our time. But Daisy, I think we might have to do another session so that we can deal with at least 55 of the 60 questions that people want to ask us. So you know, have us back if you'd like to.
We would absolutely love to have you back. We'll book you in straight away. I mean, that was such a fantastic and inspiring session, and we can't think of two more engaging and passionate advocates for the women of the ancient world, and for why we should all be talking and retelling these stories and the influence that they still have today. So thank you very much. That was really wonderful. And for all these incredible questions that have come in, as Bettany said, 60 questions, which is amazing. The books are out now. Bettany Hughes, Venus and Aphrodite is out now in paperback.
Oh, I've got this. Hold on. Look, I'll model it.
Very nice.
No, so sweet, Natalie. Thank you. Shall I, just because you've done that, can I just say a shout out to your dad, Andre? Who I think is
Hi, my dad's in love with Bettany. Everyone, just let's all accept it. It's only fair.
I love your dad. I love your dad too.
And Pandora's Jar, which is by Natalie Haynes and is also out now in paperback. Newham Bookshop have plenty of copies, so do order from them if you would like. The details are in the chat. And just a huge thank you, Bettany and Natalie, for joining us. Bettany all the way from Gibraltar, and for making this work for us.
Well, I'm not on a legal holiday, I should just say. It's not that I heard that it's on the green list. I have been digging in the Gorham Neanderthal cave all day. So just FYI before you shot me. Sorry. Yeah.
And join us again for another 5x50. Next week we have Ian Goldin, Giles Fraser and Alison Bechtel, which we're really excited about. But for this evening, thank you all and good night. Stay safe and well, and we'll see you again soon.